Hi, Kathryn. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Very well. Thank you very much. Really nice having you today. Thanks for taking the time.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So, Kathryn, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm running my own energy consulting business here in the UK. I've been doing it for almost 10 years. It'll be my 10-year anniversary in April. And
Congrats.
thank you. I work with companies really across the value chain, right from generation through midstream and down into the supply segment, not obviously all at the same time. Um, right now, I'm working a lot also with think tanks and government organizations, regulators, and corporations who are interested in how different trends in energy and in energy policy is going to impact their organizations.
Super interesting. That's really fascinating. Could you tell me a little bit about the market trends you've seen in the past month?
Okay, so I mean, you were asking me before about natural gas and biofuels, and we've had some quite interesting developments here in Britain, and just in the last couple of weeks, where our Parliament was doing an investigation into energy prices, and they had CEOs and senior executives from big energy companies. And this is when I say energy companies, I'm really talking primarily about people that engage in the retail markets, supplying gas and electricity to households. And they were discussing why are our costs so high? Why do consumers have to pay so much for their gas and electricity in particular? The UK has got the highest industrial electricity prices and the fourth highest domestic electricity prices in the developed world. But our gas prices are only the 15th highest. So finally, this is sort of cutting through. Although gas has been used as the excuse and the justification for high prices, that maybe this isn't true. And so you had all of these senior executives telling Parliament that actually the real driver of bills isn't gas at all, it's policy costs. And those policy costs are primarily around the support for renewables. And so that was quite interesting, that it was a very dramatic change in the narrative. Whereas a lot of these people privately might have recognized these things in the past, and people like me have been saying them all the time, all of a sudden they were, on television and a televised evidence to Parliament. And one guy said you could cut wholesale prices to zero and it would make no difference to the bill. And I was like, hallelujah. I've been trying to explain this to people for years now, because the way our subsidies work, the subsidies linked to the wholesale price is literally a top up. We have the contracts for different schemes, so it's literally calculated as the differential between the strike price in the contract and the wholesale market price. So if you lower the wholesale price to zero, you just increase the top up to the level of the strike. And the strike has always, with only one exception, the fourth allocation round, has always been higher than the cost of generating electricity using gas. So now it's becoming very apparent, and they're just in the process of doing the most recent auction round, and they announced the budget for that this week, and it's lower than before. And the expectation is that they're not going to be able to procure very much with the budget that they've set, probably only about 3 gigawatts if it goes ahead anyway. And there's some speculation that it won't, because the expectation is the bids will be a lot higher than the current price of generating electricity with gas, and that would be politically toxic, both for the government to sign up to and indeed for the developers. Because if you're a big wind developer and you've been telling people for all these years that wind is cheap, and now you're going to demand a price that's higher than the cost of generating electricity with gas for your 20-year subsidy, because they've just increased these from 15 to 20 years, then people are going to say, well, you're lying to us about this being cheap. And which indeed is the case. So there's a big reputational risk, and also there's a sort of a political legal risk, because the two parties, one of whom is almost certainly going to be the next government, they've both signaled that they won't necessarily honour these new contracts if they come into office. And so there's a huge risk there that they sign these contracts that are politically and reputationally damaging, and then someone rips them up in 4 years' time anyway. So I think there's a really big chance that this auction round fails. And, you know, it's all kind of drama at the moment.
Wow. Fascinating. How about like compared to Europe, the US, etc.?
Well, I think in the US we saw this starting to change anyway. You know, when the Trump administration came in with a very different take on energy. And, you know, it's weird because what Trump and Chris Wright, his energy secretary, have been saying about cheap energy being a foundation for economic growth is pretty orthodox, conventional stuff, but somehow coming from them is considered to be somehow radical. But it's not radical at all, of course. Cheap energy is the foundation for economic growth. And they just recognize the economic reality that renewables aren't cheap. And Chris Wright speaks quite powerfully about this. He shows using data that we're not actually in the process of any kind of an energy transition. If you look at the extent to which renewables are displacing fossil fuels, well, they're not. Actually, the data would support a narrative that they're replacing wood biomass more than they're replacing fossil fuels. And so you're not really seeing, and even with all, if you look at energy consumption as a whole, wind and solar are making up a tiny proportion of global consumption, and that tiny proportion hasn't really increased that much. You know, you're really at the margins. And so he says this isn't a transition, it's essentially a blip, but we're spending, you know, billions and billions of dollars in doing this little blip. And so you've got to really ask what the point is. You know, you hear all of this talk about building all these renewables, not really delivering very much. And, you know, as part of this new tender that the government's trying to run here, they've just slashed the capacity factors that they're using in their modelling for wind, because they had it at like 60%. And everyone had been saying for years that this is just stupid. Like, nobody's getting 60%. You just don't see it. And they kept saying, oh, no, but technology is improving and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, but it's just not being delivered. You know, in practice, you're getting 35% on average across offshore and onshore wind. So, and there's various different ways you can calculate it, but fundamentally, it's nowhere near 60%, and nor is there any realistic prospect it will be. You know, it's just to say that it'll get to 60% through technology developments is just wishful thinking, basically. So now they've slashed the capacity factors and like quietly, as if hoping nobody will notice, but they've only slashed them for the auction round, but they haven't slashed them in the cost of energy analysis.
Yeah.
So the cost of energy analysis still goes, yeah, it's got 60% and it's also cheap. And you're like, no, if you actually calculated it using a proper realistic capacity factor, then it would look less cheap. And this is just on a levelized cost basis anyway. So like, that's all, it's the wrong measure. Nobody pays the levelized cost, but that's the one everyone jumped on to say, oh yeah, that shows how cheap renewables are. Well, only because you socialize all the other costs of firming and, you know, balancing and low energy density impact on connections and so on. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of, it's all smoke and mirrors, to be honest, but the house of cards is falling down, to use lots
Really?
of
Okay. And so can we talk a little bit about like biofuels, LNG in emerging markets?
Well, okay, so I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and there were a lot of delegates from Africa at this conference, and their message was extremely clear. And they said these simple terms. They said, we don't face a climate crisis, we face a poverty crisis. This is our priority, is addressing poverty. Our priority is to industrialize, and our plan is to use gas to do it. Okay. And this was the message from, you know, multiple speakers. They were all saying the same thing. Wow. Poverty is our priority. Industrialization is our priority. Decarbonization is just something we can do some other time, maybe. Like, they were not interested. And okay. So yeah, I mean, I think we're inevitably going to see increasing demand for gas from emerging markets. These are trends that we already observe. Whenever you see forecasts from people like the IEA, where they suggest that we're way past sort of peak gas demand and it's all going to fall, these forecasts never, ever come to pass. They're always having to revise them upwards. It's one of the least credible forecasting measures out there, because they say, yeah, global gas demand is falling because of, you know, climate, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, then you look at what's happening in emerging markets, and it's not just gas. I mean, it's fossil fuels more broadly. You get a heat wave in India and they can't shovel the coal in their power stations fast enough to run, you know, to power AC demand, obviously. So if your priority is industrialization, you're just going to do whatever's the cheapest and quickest way of doing that. And so, of course, that's going to be very supportive for gas. And, in pricing terms, it's just a question of how that demand growth plays against the growth in supply. So obviously we're expecting the dominant narrative in the coming few years to be around supply. And that's going to depress prices because, we're going to see the market go long probably as early as next year. But demand will continue to grow. So by the end of this decade, that length will have been used up and markets will tighten again. So I think the next few years, we're actually going to be seeing some, favorable pricing for buyers. That will be a relief for consumers, particularly in Europe, who've had these high prices since the end of COVID in 2021, and then the start of the Ukraine war in 2022. It will bring price relief for them. And obviously the big sort of wild card here is what happens in Russia and whether any resolution to the conflict in Ukraine sees a return of any Russian volumes into the Western market or not. And that, I think if that were to happen, it would happen slowly. I can't see any dramatic change. But if you're thinking about time frames in which your markets might be tightening towards the end of the decade, the potential for those Russian volumes coming back to the market could alleviate some of that potential tightness. So yeah, I mean, it's a pretty interesting picture. And I think, emerging markets are definitely driving the global picture when it comes to demand growth.
Yeah. So one last question, because we did say we were going to have a short regular chat, which we'll be recording. Okay. You've got a little cat behind you.
I have,
yeah. So one last question I wanted to ask you was...
Oh, that wasn't the last one.
No, there is one last one, not about the cats, but like the forecast. How do you see like the next few weeks?
Oh, okay. So, I mean, I don't typically follow the markets in that kind of granular way. My work is more sort of strategic, long-term stuff. So, I mean, I think in terms of, the nearest I would look at would be, say, for the winter as a whole. And we've, I think there's a view that we're sort of overdue a cold winter. I went to the Met Desk Symposium a couple of weeks ago where they were presenting their winter outlook. And for Northern Europe, it did look as if it was going to be colder, particularly in the first half of the winter. And
that's good news for us, by the way, with the ski resorts just
well, I'm off to speak at a conference in Calgary next month, the Future Summit. And thankfully, this conference is about a week after the ski slopes in the Rockies open. So I'm hoping to get some early season skiing in there. But yes, I mean, the expectation, say that from the Met Desk, the long-term forecasting is suggesting that, and also lower wind. So a combination of cold weather and low wind. And also, I mean, wind output this year as a whole has been down across Europe, and also hydro output has been down. So we've actually seen quite a significant increase in gas consumption in the power sector. It's up about 17% across the EU, and a similar amount, slightly less in the UK, about 14-15%. So yes, I mean, if that continues into the winter, then obviously we'll see a higher gas burn for power consumption. That's going to depress inventories, which have been lower this year. I mean, the EU had to soften its mandate because it caused the summer-winter spread to invert. We could definitely see periods of tightness emerging in the market if those weather patterns do develop the way the forecasting suggests.
Super. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time. Lovely speaking to you.
You too.
And let's catch up soon then.
Yep, perfect.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kathryn. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.